I still remember the first time I heard their names. Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias. Two young girls, full of life, excitement, and all the innocence you'd expect from children their age. It was Mother's Day in 2005, a day meant to celebrate love, family, and togetherness. But for their families, it became something else entirely. Imagine this for a moment. It's a beautiful spring day, and the sounds of laughter echo through the streets of Zion, Illinois. Children play, mothers are celebrated, and families come together. Yet, as the sun begins to set, two families start to notice something. They notice what isn't there. Laura and Crystal hadn't come home. At first, there's confusion, then concern, and soon, an overwhelming sense of fear. I can't shake the thought of those moments. The frantic searching, the shouting of their names into the quiet of the night, hoping, begging for an answer that wouldn't come. And then, the next morning, Jerry Hobbs, Laura's father, stumbles upon a scene that no parent should ever have to see. The lifeless bodies of his daughter and her best friend, abandoned in the woods, their young lives cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. It's the kind of story that stays with you, that shakes you to your core. As the details unfolded, the community of Zion was left grappling with the unthinkable. Who could have done something so horrific to two innocent girls? How could this happen in a place where everyone knew everyone else? But as we unravel this story, I want you to ask yourself, what would you do if faced with this kind of unimaginable tragedy? And what happens when the search for justice begins to point in the wrong direction? I'd love to hear your thoughts as we explore this heartbreaking case. Have you ever felt a case didn't receive the justice it deserved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to take you back to Laura Hobbs' home before that fateful day to understand the family dynamics that shaped her world. Laura was only 8 years old, a child full of life, curiosity, and an infectious smile that lit up every room she entered. She loved playing outside, laughing with her friends, and soaking in the simple joys of childhood. But her home life wasn't always so carefree. Her father, Jerry Hobbs, had a complicated past. A man with his share of troubles, Jerry had been in and out of trouble with the law, his temper often getting the better of him. His relationship with Laura's mother was turbulent, marked by periods of separation and tension. For a time, it seemed Jerry was a man lost in his own storm. But in 2005, Jerry returned to Zion. He had reconciled with Laura's mother and was determined to rebuild his family. Those who knew him said he seemed different, quieter, as if he were trying to leave his past behind and start over. For Laura, having her father back at home was something she cherished. She was a daddy's girl through and through, often holding his hand, looking up at him with adoration. She was a child who saw the world with wide eyes, unaware of the shadows that sometimes loomed too close. It's hard not to think about the life she could have lived, the milestones she never reached, the dreams she never got to chase. And then there was Crystal Tobias, Laura's best friend and constant companion. At 9 years old, Crystal was the kind of girl who made friends effortlessly. She had an adventurous spirit and a kind heart that made her beloved by everyone who knew her. Her family was hardworking, a reflection of the tight-knit community they called home. Crystal and Laura were inseparable, the kind of best friends who could spend hours together, whether they were playing in the park, riding bikes, or whispering secrets only they would ever know. Their bond was pure, unbreakable, a friendship so strong that they were almost like sisters. It's said that Crystal had a knack for making people laugh, her sense of humor bringing light into any room. She had a future full of promise, a life just beginning to bloom. But her story, like Laura's, was about to be tragically cut short. When you think of the innocence of two young girls like Laura and Crystal, it's hard not to feel the weight of their loss. They were everything good about childhood, untouched by the harsh realities of the world around them. At least that's what everyone believed. Zion, Illinois, was the kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. It was a quiet, suburban town nestled along the shores of Lake Michigan, with tree-lined streets and parks where children played without a care in the world. The community was tight-knit, a place where everyone knew everyone, and neighbors looked out for one another. For the Hobbs and Tobias families, Zion was home, a place they believed their children could grow up safe and happy. The local park, with its winding trails and wooded areas, was a favorite spot for families and kids. It was the kind of town where laughter and chatter filled the air, where parents trusted that their children could roam freely and return home when the streetlights came on. But even in a place like Zion, there were cracks beneath the surface. The town wasn't immune to hardship. Economic struggles, shifting social dynamics, and an undercurrent of tension sometimes reminded people that nowhere was truly perfect. Still, for Laura and Crystal, Zion was their playground, their world. It's impossible to reconcile the image of those two girls running through the park, carefree and full of life, with what would come next. The tragedy that unfolded in this seemingly idyllic town shattered its sense of safety and left scars that would never heal. For now, though, let's stay in this moment. Let's hold onto the image of Laura and Crystal as they were. Two children living their best days in a town that felt like it would always protect them. May 8, 2005, was a day that started like so many others, filled with warmth and celebration. It was Mother's Day, a time for families to come together, to show appreciation for the women who hold everything together. The Hobbs and Tobias families were no different. There were smiles, hugs, and quiet moments of joy. Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias spent part of the day at home, surrounded by the people they loved. At some point in the afternoon, the two best friends decided to head outside to play. It was the kind of thing they did all the time, something so ordinary that no one thought twice about it. They were young, carefree, and full of energy. And Zion was a town where kids playing outdoors felt like the safest thing in the world. As the hours passed, the sun began to dip lower in the sky. Dinner was being prepared in homes across Zion, and families were settling in for the evening. But in two households, there was a growing sense of unease. Laura and Crystal hadn't come home. At first, the assumption was simple. They'd lost track of time, as kids often do. But when their names were called out into the streets and there was no response, worry began to take hold. By nightfall, the unease had turned into full-blown panic. Calls were made, neighbors were alerted, and the streets of Zion began to fill with people looking for the two missing girls. It wasn't just the family searching now, it was the entire community. Flashlights swept through yards, voices echoed through the darkness, and a deep, gnawing fear began to settle over everyone involved. Where were Laura and Crystal? And why hadn't they come home? As the hours dragged on, the search intensified. Friends, neighbors, and local law enforcement scoured the area, focusing on the park where the girls were last seen. Parents clung to the hope that their daughters were simply hiding somewhere, playing a game that had gone on too long. But deep down, an unspoken fear gripped everyone. In the Hobbs and Tobias households, the emotional toll was overwhelming. Mothers paced the floor, clutching photos of their daughters, whispering prayers into the void. Fathers organized search parties, their voices hoarse from shouting their children's names into the night. Every passing minute without an answer felt like an eternity. The community rallied in a way that only happens during times of crisis. People who had never spoken before worked side by side, driven by a shared determination to bring the girls home. But as dawn approached, the mood began to shift. Exhaustion and dread replaced the initial rush of adrenaline. The light of day was coming, and with it, the harsh reality that the girls might not be found alive. The morning of May 9, 2005, began with a discovery that would change everything. Jerry Hobbs, Laura's father, was among those continuing the search in the wooded area of Beulah Park. With every step, he called out his daughter's name, hoping against hope that she would answer. But what he found instead was something no parent should ever have to face. In a clearing surrounded by trees, Jerry stumbled upon the lifeless bodies of Laura and Crystal. The girls had been brutally attacked, their small frames marked by unspeakable violence. Jerry's screams of anguish echoed through the woods, a sound that would haunt those who heard it for years to come. Word spread quickly, and the park was soon swarming with police, investigators, and devastated community members. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, and news cameras began to arrive, capturing the raw grief etched into the faces of the girls' families. For Zion, a town that had always felt safe, this was a nightmare made real. The immediate aftermath was a blur of emotions, shock, heartbreak, and an overwhelming need for answers. How could this happen? Who could do something so monstrous? And why had these innocent girls been targeted? The discovery of Laura and Crystal's bodies marked the beginning of a long and painful journey for their families and the entire community. This part of the story is one of unimaginable pain and loss. As you listen, what emotions does this bring up for you? Can you imagine being in the family's shoes, searching desperately for answers only to be met with a reality like this? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. In the wake of the horrific discovery of Laura and Crystal's bodies, the police were under immense pressure to find answers quickly. The small, tight-knit community of Zion was in shock, but there was one common thread. Everyone wanted justice. The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through the entire town, and with each passing hour, fear began to grip the hearts of every parent. Who could be capable of such violence? Was the killer still out there, lurking in their midst? The intensity of the investigation was palpable. Police canvassed neighborhoods, questioned witnesses, and gathered every scrap of evidence they could find. The community, reeling from grief, wanted answers and fast. As investigators searched for suspects, every possible lead was pursued and every theory considered. At first, there was speculation that the girls might have been attacked by someone who wasn't local, perhaps a stranger who had come into the area. But as the investigation went on, something began to shift. The focus started to narrow, and as it did, suspicion turned inward. What if the killer was someone close to the families? Someone who knew the girls? The search for a suspect was now a race against time. But with every new piece of information, the investigation became murkier, and the community grew more anxious. Amidst the flurry of investigations, one person quickly became the prime suspect, Jerry Hobbs. At first, it may have seemed unlikely. Jerry was a father who had been desperately searching for his daughter, a man who had already faced the unbearable loss of losing a child. But then the police began to focus on his past, and that's when things started to take a troubling turn. Jerry had a history, one that included run-ins with the law and a period of separation from his wife. He wasn't a stranger to police, and his criminal background became the foundation for suspicions that would haunt him for years to come. It wasn't just that Jerry had a past. It was that the police, in their desperation for answers, began to see him as the most likely suspect. In the eyes of the authorities, it seemed too convenient that the father of one of the victims was so heavily involved in the search. The more Jerry tried to help, the more he became entangled in a web of suspicion. The police were determined to get answers, and they weren't about to let Jerry go without a fight. In the hours that followed, Jerry was brought in for questioning. What followed was a lengthy and intense interrogation, a grueling experience that would break him. Under immense pressure, Jerry was coerced into giving a confession. His statement was filled with contradictions, vague details, and obvious inconsistencies. He claimed to have committed the murders, but it was clear to everyone involved that the confession wasn't genuine. Jerry would later recount how the confession had been forced from him, how the police used psychological pressure, threats, and tactics that made him feel like there was no way out. They convinced him that he was already guilty in their eyes, and with the overwhelming weight of the interrogation, he eventually gave in. It was a moment that would forever alter the course of his life, a moment when a desperate man made a choice that would come to haunt him. But there was a crucial detail that went unnoticed at the time. Jerry's confession didn't align with the physical evidence. The more investigators dug, the more the case began to unravel, showing that Jerry's confession was not based on truth, but rather a product of coercion and fear. Jerry Hobbs' arrest sent shockwaves through Zion. The man who had been out there, searching for his daughter, was now behind bars, charged with the brutal murders of Laura and Crystal. For many, the arrest was a relief. The police had found their suspect, and justice seemed within reach. But for those closest to Jerry, it was a nightmare. His family, already reeling from the loss of Laura, was now faced with the horror of knowing that the police had arrested the wrong man. The community, too, was torn. Some believed that the authorities had done their job, that the confession proved Jerry's guilt. Others, however, were filled with doubt, questioning whether someone so emotionally distraught could have truly been capable of such violence. The townspeople who had once known Jerry as a father trying to rebuild his life now saw him in a different light, as a possible killer. But even as the investigation seemed to draw to a close, cracks began to show in the case against Jerry. The physical evidence didn't match his confession, and the more the police probed, the more inconsistencies surfaced. Jerry's arrest had come too quickly. The investigation too focused on him, without enough regard for other possible suspects. And as the case moved toward trial, many began to question whether the pursuit of justice had been clouded by a rush to close the case, rather than seeking the true killer. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. This case, and the journey toward justice, is far from over, and you don't want to miss what happens next. While Jerry Hobbs sat in a prison cell, fighting for his innocence, a breakthrough was quietly unfolding that would forever alter the course of this case. DNA evidence had been collected from the crime scene, but due to a series of delays, the results didn't come to light as quickly as they should have. Weeks turned into months, and months into years, as the investigation seemed to stall. At the time, the focus had been on Jerry, with his coerced confession and the pressure to close the case. But one critical element was missing: the connection between Jerry and the actual crime. As forensic technology advanced, the DNA evidence that had been overlooked or underprioritized in the rush to convict Jerry was finally tested in 2008, years after the girls were killed. What investigators discovered was nothing short of a revelation. The DNA collected from the crime scene, found on the victims, did not match Jerry Hobbs at all. In fact, it didn't match anyone who had been considered a suspect in the case, at least not until the evidence was linked to a man named Jorge Avila Torres, a name that had never been on the radar during the investigation. The delay in testing the DNA had allowed Jerry's wrongful conviction to drag on for years, costing him precious time with his family, his reputation, and his sanity. It was clear now that the initial investigation had been flawed, that the case had been rushed, and that the true killer had been free all along. Jorge Avila Torres was not a name that would immediately raise alarms for many. But when investigators dug into his past, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Avila Torres had served in the U.S. military and had a history of violent behavior. His time in the military had included incidents of aggression and even assault, painting a clear picture of a man with a propensity for violence. But it wasn't until the DNA evidence connected him to the brutal murders of Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias that the full scope of his past came into focus. Avila Torres had been living in the area around the time of the murders, but his name had never been connected to the case. He was a ghost in the investigation, moving through the cracks unnoticed, until the DNA finally caught up with him. When the results of the DNA testing came back, investigators were left stunned by the link between Avila Torres and the crime scene. In the years following the murders, Avila Torres had continued his life, seemingly unbothered by the blood on his hands. But the breakthrough in the case made it clear that he had been the one to take the lives of two innocent girls on that fateful day in 2005. The discovery was a game changer, a moment of clarity that shattered the false narrative surrounding Jerry Hobbs and pointed to the real killer. The exoneration of Jerry Hobbs wasn't just a legal victory. It was an emotional tidal wave. Jerry had spent nearly 4 years in prison, wrongly convicted of a crime he did not commit. The weight of that time in prison had taken a tremendous toll on him, emotionally, physically, and mentally. Imagine waking up every day in a cell, knowing that the world outside had already made up its mind about you. Imagine the years slipping away, knowing that you had not just lost time with your daughter, but also with your family, your friends, and your life. When Jerry was finally released from prison in 2009, the moment was bittersweet. On the one hand, he was a free man, cleared of all charges, with his innocence now firmly established. But on the other, he had lost so much. His life had been forever altered, and there was no way to erase the years spent behind bars for a crime he hadn't committed. His release, while a moment of victory for justice, was a stark reminder of the flaws in the system. Jerry had spent years in prison for something he didn't do, his life stolen by the rush to judgment and the failure to consider all the evidence. Now he had to rebuild his life, rebuild his relationship with his family, and rebuild his sense of self after the trauma he'd endured. As we witness the power of DNA evidence in this case, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the use of DNA evidence in solving cold cases? Is it the key to unlocking justice, or does it create more challenges? Share your thoughts below. I'm eager to hear what you think. The day that Jorge Avila Torres finally stood trial for the brutal murders of Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias was a long-awaited moment for the families, the community, and everyone who had followed the case. After years of wrongful accusations, confusion, and a flawed investigation, the moment had finally arrived when the true perpetrator would be held accountable for his horrific actions. Avila Torres faced charges of 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for each innocent life he had taken on that fateful day in May 2005. As the trial began, there was a sense of both hope and anguish in the courtroom. The evidence, now irrefutable, painted a clear picture of the man responsible. DNA evidence, fingerprints, and witness testimony left no room for doubt. The prosecution's case was strong, backed by the solid forensic evidence linking Avila Torres to the crime scene. They carefully laid out the timeline, from the moment the girls were last seen alive to the discovery of their bodies, and every detail pointed to one person, Jorge Avila Torres. However, the most powerful moments of the trial came from the victims' families. Jerry Hobbs, who had been wrongfully accused and imprisoned for years, attended the trial, though he was not required to testify. The emotional toll of hearing about his daughter's final moments was apparent, but he knew that this was a necessary step toward justice. The statements made by Laura's and Crystal's families in court were heart-wrenching. The pain they had endured over the years was evident, and they spoke directly to the court, expressing the devastation of losing their loved ones in such a brutal manner. One particularly poignant moment came when Crystal's mother tearfully spoke about the loss of her daughter, describing how her young girl had loved life, played with friends, and had dreams of a bright future. The sorrow in the courtroom was overwhelming, a raw reminder of the cost of the tragedy, a cost that could never be repaid. After a tense and emotional trial, the jury deliberated, and the verdict was delivered. Jorge Avila Torres was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder for the killings of Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and grief. While justice had been served, the damage done to these families could never be undone. Avila Torres was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm anyone. The sentence brought some closure to the families who had waited for years to see the true killer behind bars. But it could not erase the pain they had endured or the years lost in their pursuit of justice. For Jerry Hobbs, the exoneration and the conviction of the real killer were bittersweet. While the truth had finally come to light, the years he spent in prison, years that should have been spent with his daughter, would never be returned. For him, the conviction of Avila Torres brought a sense of justice, but also a reminder of the terrible cost that had been paid. The trial and conviction of Jorge Avila Torres marked the end of one chapter of this tragic story, but it also highlighted the deep flaws within the justice system that had caused so much pain along the way. The wrongful accusation of Jerry Hobbs had been a glaring example of how important it is for investigators and law enforcement to approach cases with diligence, care, and objectivity. The pressure to find a suspect, especially in a case as high-profile as this one, can cloud judgment and lead to disastrous consequences. Jerry's coerced confession was a chilling reminder of the dangers of interrogation techniques that rely on manipulation and pressure rather than evidence. His wrongful conviction was not just the result of faulty evidence. It was the result of an investigation that jumped to conclusions, that rushed to pin the blame on anyone who seemed to fit the profile. The case also raised questions about the handling of evidence, particularly the DNA samples collected from the crime scene. The failure to test that evidence sooner cost Jerry Hobbs years of his life and kept the real killer on the streets. This tragic case served as a wake-up call for the need to reform the system, to ensure that law enforcement is better equipped to handle cases with the sensitivity and attention they deserve. There was no perfect justice for Jerry Hobbs. The years spent in prison would forever remain a part of his story. But the conviction of Avila Torres provided a sense of justice that was long overdue, a reminder that even when the system fails, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. After all of this, I want to hear from you. Do you think the justice system in cases like this needs to be reformed? What changes do you think could prevent wrongful accusations, like the one Jerry Hobbs suffered, from happening again? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what you think about the flaws that were exposed in this case. As we reach the end of this harrowing journey, we are reminded of the terrible cost of the tragedy that struck Zion, Illinois, in May 2005. Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias, two innocent young girls, were taken from their families in the most brutal of ways. Their lives, full of promise, laughter, and childhood wonder, were cruelly stolen, leaving an indelible mark on everyone who knew them. The emotional toll on the families, the confusion in the community, and the struggle for justice were unimaginable. This case became more than just the story of two murdered children. It became a testament to the flaws within the criminal justice system, the dangers of rushing to conclusions, and the importance of persistence in seeking the truth. For Jerry Hobbs, the wrongful accusation and years spent in prison remain a lifelong burden. The release of the real killer, Jorge Avila Torres, didn't erase the years of pain and suffering he endured, but it brought a bittersweet form of justice. For the victims' families, the conviction of Avila Torres, though long awaited, could not fully restore the lives of their daughters. The damage done was irreversible. But there is one undeniable lesson we can all take away from this case. The fight for justice is never easy. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes an unwavering belief in the truth. And sometimes it requires exposing the darkest corners of the system. But in the end, the pursuit of justice for the victims and their families is essential, no matter the hurdles. As we reflect on this heartbreaking case, I want to hear from you. What's your biggest takeaway from this story? Do you think the justice system worked here? Were the flaws exposed during the investigation and trial enough to prompt real change? What do you think could have been done differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The pursuit of justice is never straightforward, and it's crucial that we, as a society, continue to learn from these mistakes to ensure that the victims' voices are heard and their stories never go forgotten. If you found this story as impactful and heartbreaking as I did, make sure to give this video a like. Share it with others so they can hear this story and understand the complexities of the criminal justice system. If you want to stay informed and hear more gripping stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We've got many more cases, investigations, and lessons to explore together. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where we dive into another true crime story that will keep you on the edge of your seat.